At dawn, they didn't hear gunshots. They smelled firewood and beef fat. The Japanese women lined up barefoot in the cold Nevada dirt, eyes fixed on the rising sun. They had been told it would end this morning, that American guards, tired of mouthy captives and wartime politics, would do what the Japanese officers never had, end their shame. The women braced for bullets. Instead, a breeze carried something else. Smoky, savory, impossible. One girl blinked at the distant movement. Not rifles drawn, but boots kicked up, hats tilted low, tin pans sizzling over open flame. Cowboys, real American cowboys, laughing around a campfire like ghosts from a movie. One waved a forkful of meat. "You girls eat?" he hollered. It made no sense. The war was still on. Some of the women began to cry, not from fear, but from confusion. What kind of enemy roasted steak where executions should be? One nurse looked down at her trembling hands. "They're mocking us," she whispered. But deep down, she wasn't so sure anymore. The memories that led her here smelled of rust and blood, not mesquite smoke and sizzling beef. 2 weeks earlier, she had stood in a rusted freight car with 40 other women, hands bound in rough hemp, boots worn down to the soles. No one spoke above a whisper. They'd been taken under the cover of night, loaded onto the train without explanation. The guards refused to answer questions, and the destination was only ever described in rumor: the pit, the furnace, the edge of nowhere. Some said they were being shipped to be shot, others to be sterilized, and one woman swore this was the route to secret American labs that performed human tests. The truth felt irrelevant. They were prisoners, and prisoners didn't get endings. They vanished. Through cracks in the wood, the women watched the land change. Forests gave way to plains, then nothing but dust, sky, and heat. The American desert rolled endlessly, like a sea that had forgotten water. On the 7th day, the train screeched to a halt near a barren outpost, flanked by scrub brush and wind. The women were pulled off 2 at a time, blinking into the sun like owls. The air tasted of iron and smoke. No signage, no flags, just barbed wire and a low wooden building slouching against the horizon. The only sound was the steady groan of wind and the soft crunch of boots on gravel. They called it a camp, but it didn't look like one. No marching troops, no barking dogs, just fences, a few watchtowers, and strange quiet. Too quiet. The guards wore wide-brimmed hats and khaki instead of olive drab. Some had sunburns peeling on their cheeks. A few had the soft drawl of the American South, muttering to one another in low tones that made the women's skin prickle. It was not Geneva. This was outlaw country. Inside the wire, everything was strange. The barracks were clean but weather-beaten. No blood on the floors, no chains on the walls. The beds had blankets folded neatly at their ends. A basin of fresh water waited at the back of the room. No beatings, no interrogations, just silence. The absence of cruelty felt more menacing than cruelty itself. They had been told surrender was worse than death. In whispered lessons during training, it had been made clear: women who let themselves be captured would be defiled, tortured, erased. The Bushido Code offered no room for captivity, death cleansed, dishonor condemned. And yet, here they were, undressed, unsearched, unscarred. That first night, the silence was deafening. No screaming, no boots stomping down the hallway, just the hiss of wind against the siding and the rhythmic hum of desert insects. One woman sat upright for hours, convinced the Americans were drugging the air with some hallucinogen. Another picked at the edges of her blanket, whispering a prayer to a god she hadn't spoken to in months. Every breath, every quiet footstep, felt like a countdown. "They're softening us," one muttered. "Feeding the pigs before slaughter." Another, older, shook her head. "No, this is American theater. They want to see if we'll beg when they put the barrels to our heads." But dawn didn't bring violence. It brought smoke and something impossible. The tang of firewood, a sound like laughter, and the unmistakable smell of beef. It should have been the final blow. Instead, it was breakfast. And that single betrayal of expectation began to undo something deeper than fear. It began to unravel certainty. For a moment the women didn't move. The smell rolled across the camp like a wave, thick and savory, a scent none of them had inhaled in months. Meat, real meat, not the sour stench of dried fish or the bitter aftertaste of boiled weeds. This was roasted flesh, peppered and seared, smoke-kissed and impossibly rich. It snuck past the barbed wire and curled into their lungs, dragging their memories with it. And that's when the visions returned. In the jungle, the air had smelled of rot. Skin cracked beneath the sun. Maggots bloomed in wounds. Their meals, if they could be called that, came from aluminum tins rusted at the seams. They had gnawed rice cakes black with mildew, dug through soil for roots, and drank rainwater filtered through torn uniforms. One girl, just 17, had tried to eat the leather off her boot. Another slit her own wrist rather than be caught. Better to bleed in the mud than risk dishonor. That was how they lived. That was how they expected to die. Now they stood in the middle of an American camp where cowboys grilled steak before dawn. The men were like something from a radio serial. Hats tilted back, boots planted wide, humming tuneless songs through teeth clenched around toothpicks. They crouched over an open flame, flipping slabs of beef with iron forks and murmuring to each other like it was just another morning on the range. One even had a red bandana knotted at his throat. It was absurd, surreal. The nurse, the one with shaking hands, squinted at the smoke rising in lazy plumes. She half expected the illusion to vanish, for the beef to turn into charred bone, for the men to drop their disguises and raise rifles. But they didn't. They just kept cooking. A younger girl beside her whispered, "Is this some kind of humiliation?" Her voice was hoarse from dehydration, her lips cracked. "They want to break us," someone muttered behind her. "They're fattening us before the slaughter," said another. But the tone lacked certainty. No one could quite explain what they were seeing. The cowboys didn't leer. They didn't shout. They barely looked at the women. One reached into a battered cooler and pulled out another cut of beef. He salted it with a practiced hand, the crystals catching the early morning sun. Another poked the fire, sending a hiss of smoke into the sky. Then he looked up, directly at them, and lifted his fork. "Y'all hungry?" he called out in English thick as tar. No one answered. The prisoners stood frozen. The question didn't make sense. It was too normal. Too easy. He laughed. Not cruelly, not mockingly, just laughed like a man who'd made a joke at the wrong time. "Well, suit yourselves," he said, and went back to flipping meat. The women returned to the barracks in silence, not out of obedience, but because none of them could find the right words. No commands had been given, no punishments threatened. They simply turned and walked away, like smoke retreating from fire. Inside, one woman pressed her face against the slatted wall and watched the fire until the smell faded. Another sat on the edge of her cot, whispering the word beef to herself in disbelief. They all knew war was cruel, but no one had told them it could be this strange. By the time the sun fully rose, the camp smelled of ash and memory. The fire had died down, and the cowboys were gone. But the confusion remained. The women lay in their bunks, stomachs growling, their beliefs unraveling slowly. Not from hunger, but from kindness they could not name. The next morning the door to the barracks creaked open, and the smell arrived before the guards did, thick, meaty, unmistakable. Not smoke this time, but stew, real stew, the kind that clung to your ribs and warmed your chest, the kind that, until now, had only existed in memory. A soldier stepped in and gave a short nod, not unkind, just matter-of-fact. He gestured toward the mess hall with a jerk of his thumb. No rifles aimed, no orders barked, just a quiet, patient expectation. The women hesitated. Some stood, others didn't move. The nurse from the night before rose slowly, one hand braced on her cot. Her legs ached from days of cramped travel. She expected this was still part of the act, some drawn-out test designed to soften them before the blow. Still, hunger had teeth sharper than pride. They followed the smell down the dirt path toward a squat wooden building. Inside, the heat hit them like a wall. Steam fogged the windows, trays clattered. American soldiers, some dressed in aprons stained with grease, moved between stoves, serving pots and counters with casual efficiency. Each woman was handed a metal tray. On it, 2 scoops of potatoes, a ladle of beef stew, a small pile of beans, and a biscuit soaked in something thick and brown. Gravy. One prisoner stared at it as if it might speak. They sat at long wooden tables, arranged like a school cafeteria. No one told them where to go. No one shouted. The silence inside the hall was broken only by the scrape of trays, the clang of utensils, the nervous rustle of fabric. The nurse took a bite. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. Warmth flooded her mouth, salt and fat and something almost sweet. She swallowed and instantly felt tears prick her eyes. She looked down, ashamed of the emotion. Across the table, another woman was shaking. Spoon paused in mid-air. One whispered, "They'll take it away. Eat fast." But no one did. No one took anything away. Still, they didn't trust it. Not completely. One woman tucked her biscuit into the fold of her uniform, eyes darting toward the guards. Another pocketed a few beans. A third didn't eat at all. She sat rigid, arms crossed, staring at the wall like she was in front of a firing squad. "They want us to forget what we are," someone murmured. "No," another replied, voice cracking. "They want us to forget what they are." The guards didn't hover. They didn't smile either. Most simply leaned against the far wall, chatting in quiet English. Their expressions were unreadable, tired perhaps, detached, not cruel, not joyful, just present. One walked past a table, eyes glancing over the women. He paused briefly, then adjusted a loose tray that was sliding off the edge. No words, no threat, just a small correction of balance. It was that gesture, the small, meaningless act of care, that nearly broke one of them. A girl, barely 20, let out a sudden, strangled sob and dropped her spoon. It clattered loudly. She slapped a hand over her mouth. All eyes turned. She expected punishment, a slap, a shove, a boot to the ribs. But the guard closest to her only raised an eyebrow. After a beat, he nodded once. Then he walked away. They ate in silence after that, chewing slowly, thinking carefully. The stew was nourishment, yes, but it was something more. It was a challenge, a contradiction, a quiet insult to everything they had been taught. As the trays emptied and the room emptied with them, one woman stood by the door before leaving. She looked back at the long tables, at the steam still rising from the pots, and she whispered to herself, "What kind of war is this?" Then she stepped out into the sunlight. The light was soft on her face, almost forgiving, and it made her flinch. Forgiveness wasn't supposed to exist here. Captivity was meant to be a sentence, not a sanctuary. She had been trained to meet cruelty with stoicism, to die with honor rather than live with shame. But now, even the sun felt like part of some unbearable kindness. And kindness was far harder to endure than violence. The bunk beds had thin mattresses but real blankets, not burlap sacks or bamboo mats. The wood beneath her back didn't bruise. The pillow was coarse but clean. At night there were no beatings, no guards yelling in drunken anger, only the murmur of insects outside the barracks and the occasional low whistle of wind between boards. And every morning the food returned. Not a trick, not a trap. Potatoes, stew, bread, coffee, warm and endless. She couldn't look at the guards, not out of fear, but because of what their faces represented. Human eyes, human voices, human decency. She had been told that Americans were beasts, but beasts didn't hold doors open. Beasts didn't say ma'am. One evening, as the women lay curled under their blankets, a voice broke the silence. It was quiet, cracked, almost childlike. "Why are they being kind?" No one answered right away. The words were too sharp, too dangerous, but the question had already pierced the room like a blade. Another voice followed, lower and bitter. "To humiliate us, make us weak before they destroy us." "No," someone else said. "This is worse than humiliation. It's pity." The nurse pressed her face into her pillow. She remembered her training, the way the instructors spoke of surrender as a stain that could never be washed clean. Better to fall on your blade than to be captured. Better to burn than bow. That was Bushido. It was not written for women, but they had absorbed it all the same. To be fed by the enemy was to become less than nothing. And yet her belly was full. Each act of mercy twisted something inside her. When the American doctor replaced her bandage without flinching, she felt more exposed than if he'd struck her. When a soldier handed her an apple without a word, she nearly threw it at him, not from hate, but from shame. Some women resisted by clinging tighter to ritual. They sat stiff-backed during meals. They avoided speaking unless addressed. They washed their own clothes by hand, even when offered help. Anything to preserve a sliver of control, a sliver of dignity. But for others, the walls were beginning to crack. They whispered in the dark, voices half swallowed by the night. What if they aren't lying? What if this is how they really live? A girl from Okinawa told the story of her brother, who had leapt from a cliff rather than fall into enemy hands. "He died with honor," she said, her voice trembling. But when she looked down at her hands, soft now, no longer bloodied from digging trenches, she didn't sound convinced. The contradiction hung in the air like smoke. If the Americans were monsters, why did they treat prisoners with more kindness than some officers had shown their own men? If surrender was death, why did she feel more alive here than she had in the last 6 months of war? She remembered a corporal screaming at a wounded soldier for limping too slowly. She remembered children eating paper scraps in Manila. She remembered sleeping on broken stone with rats chewing through her pack. And now, here, in a land that smelled of roasted meat and soap, she was being told, without words, that maybe she mattered. That was the real punishment. Not the hunger, not the fear, but the unbearable weight of being seen, being cared for, being humanized by the very people she had once vowed to destroy. And still, in the night, that question returned, again and again, whispered like a prayer or a curse. Why are they being kind? The question still echoed in her head the morning the guards brought out the paper. Stacks of it, yellowed and lined. Beside it, pencils, stubby, well-used, missing erasers. One soldier placed them on a table in the middle of the barracks without fanfare. Then he looked at the group of women, expression blank, and said in broken Japanese, "Right home." The silence was immediate and total. Right home? Home was a place that felt unreachable, both in distance and in shame. These were not women returning victorious. They were not war brides or nurses or factory heroes. They were prisoners, disgraced, silenced, forgotten. Writing home felt like opening an old wound and expecting it to heal. At first, no one moved. A few stared at the paper like it might explode. Others looked at the guards, eyes narrowed with suspicion. What was the trick? What information were they supposed to reveal? What trap waited beneath the surface of this new, impossible kindness? But then one woman stepped forward. She was older than most, maybe in her 40s, with streaks of gray just beginning to touch her temples. Her name was Sachiko, and she had once taught literature to schoolgirls in Osaka. She sat down slowly, picked up the pencil with a shaking hand, and began to write. "Mother, I am alive. The Americans did not kill me. They gave me bread. A cowboy roasted beef and called me ma'am." He smiled like we were equals. She paused, looked up. No one stopped her. The moment broke something open. Another woman stepped forward, then another. Soon, the pencils were passed around like sacred relics. Every woman who touched one hesitated, hovering over the page as if waiting for the right words to fall from the ceiling. But words didn't come easily. What could they say? We were told they would torture us. Instead, they gave us stew. We were told we'd be mocked. Instead, they called us miss. We were told surrender meant death. But here we are, alive and fed and confused. One girl, no older than 20, gripped the pencil so tightly it snapped in half. She cried without sound, tears dripping onto the page as she scribbled something over and over again. "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." Not all the letters were long. Some were barely a paragraph. Others were nothing but lists. Foods they had eaten, names of other prisoners, descriptions of sunsets over the wire. One woman drew a picture, a fire, a cowboy hat, a fork. They all knew the letters would be read by censors, maybe intercepted, maybe burned. But that wasn't the point. The act of writing was not for survival, it was for reclamation. A statement. We are still here. We still have voices. In a war built on silence and obedience, this was a quiet mutiny. Even those who didn't write sat nearby, watching the pencils move, witnessing what felt like both betrayal and rebirth. Each stroke was a rebellion against the version of reality they had been fed. Sachiko folded her letter carefully, hands trembling. She didn't sign it with her name. She simply wrote, "Your daughter," and tucked the page into the envelope. The guard who collected it didn't read it, didn't comment, just nodded and walked away. That night, under the thin glow of a desert moon, the barracks were filled with a different kind of silence, not fear, but reflection. The kind that comes when truth is finally allowed to escape, even if only in ink. For the first time since captivity, the women didn't feel like prisoners. They felt like messengers, witnesses. And in that, something small but unbreakable began to return. Dignity. It came not as a roar, but as a whisper in the shape of a paper bag. One afternoon, under the wide Nevada sun, a guard approached the barracks with something in his hand, not a weapon, not a clipboard, but a crumpled brown sack. He didn't say much, just walked up to one of the women and gently placed it in her palm. "Grow something," he muttered, his accent thick and slow. Then he turned and walked away. The woman, Akiko, a nurse from Sapporo, opened the bag cautiously. Inside were seeds, tiny, dry, ordinary. At first she thought it was a joke, some strange American metaphor. Another woman leaned over her shoulder and laughed under her breath. "They're mocking us again, telling us we're useless." But Akiko didn't feel mocked. That night, she held the seeds in her hands long after lights out. They rattled softly, like bone, but they didn't frighten her. They reminded her of something else: her mother's kitchen garden, rows of daikon and spinach, the way her father used to pinch the soil between his fingers and test it for warmth. That was before the war, before hunger made every thought about survival. In the morning, she walked to the edge of the yard, just inside the wire. The guards didn't stop her. She knelt slowly, joints stiff from sleeping on hard cots, and touched the dirt. For the first time in months, her hands moved across the earth without fear of blood, ash, or ruin. Just soil, dry, cracked, stubborn, but still earth. She began to dig. Others watched from a distance. One scoffed. "They want us to play house? What's next, dolls and ribbons?" Another crossed her arms, muttering, "We're soldiers. This is childish." But a few drifted closer, curious, silent. One woman knelt beside Akiko without a word and began helping. Not because she believed, but because she couldn't bear to watch someone kneel alone. A garden didn't grow overnight, but something else began to shift. The guards continued their strange campaign of gestures. One passed out small cakes of soap, wrapped in wax paper, smelling faintly of lavender. Another whistled a tune one morning while unlocking the barracks. A scratchy record player appeared near the mess hall, and on certain evenings, slow, mournful American songs drifted across the wire, carried on the wind like smoke. These were not orders, not threats, just moments, slivers of something unspoken, and in between the garden grew. The first sprout arrived 2 weeks later, a green whisper pushing through the dirt. Akiko stared at it like it was a ghost. Her fingers trembled as she brushed soil from its stem. A life, here, amid fences and shame. The other women noticed. One by one they wandered over, crouched near the plot, and watched the leaves unfold. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Something inside them began to crack, not in despair, but in release. They had been trained to believe surrender was worse than death. That kindness from the enemy was deception. That comfort was weakness. But soap soothed aching skin. Music filled hollow spaces, and seeds became plants. None of them said it out loud, but the truth was there in the silence between footsteps, in the way their shoulders loosened, in the cautious smiles that passed like contraband between bunks. The garden became more than a garden. It was defiance, not against America, but against everything they had been told about what it meant to lose. Because here, beneath the wire, something had taken root, and no one, not the emperor, not the army, not even fear itself, could unplant it. It started with a harmonica. A guard, the lanky one with the crooked smile and the permanent sunburn across his nose, walked past the barracks one evening, spinning the small metal instrument in his fingers. At first, the women thought it was a weapon. He paused at the edge of the yard, leaned against the fence, and without a word, brought it to his lips. The first notes were awkward, warbled, off-key, but they were unmistakably music. A ripple of confusion moved through the barracks. The sound was so out of place it felt like a hallucination. A few women covered their ears. Others crept to the door, drawn by something they couldn't name. The tune wobbled, stopped, then started again. Eventually he found his rhythm, a slow, mournful version of something vaguely Western. Not military, not triumphant, something simple, something human. Then came the voice. Another guard, older and broader, began to sing. His voice was gravel and dust. He sang in English, the words mostly lost on the women, but the tone was clear. Longing, homesickness, a kind of weathered warmth. It was a Hank Williams tune, though none of the prisoners knew the name. What they heard was not the lyrics, but the ache behind them. And then, unexpectedly, someone laughed. It was short, sharp, almost involuntary. One of the girls, the youngest, the one who had hidden bread in her sleeve, clapped a hand over her mouth immediately, as if she'd just confessed a crime. Her eyes darted toward the guards, then toward her fellow prisoners. But no one scolded her. In fact, the nurse, Akiko, began to chuckle too, softly at first, then louder. The absurdity of it all washed over her. A cowboy singing beneath barbed wire, a harmonica played off-key in the middle of a prison yard, the scent of lavender soap still lingering on her skin. Laughter broke like a wave. A few more joined in, and soon the barracks trembled with something it hadn't held in months. Joy, brief, fragile, terrifying. And yet, as quickly as it arrived, shame followed. The girl who had laughed first curled into herself, whispering apologies. Another turned her back to the room, shaking her head. "They'll say we've gone soft," she muttered. "They'll say we've forgotten." Because to laugh here, to feel anything other than hatred, felt like betrayal. Not to their country, perhaps, but to the dead, to those who hadn't survived, to those who had fallen believing the enemy was unworthy of mercy. Still, one woman, the quiet one who rarely spoke, kept humming the tune under her breath long after the harmonica fell silent. The next day the guard left the harmonica by the mess hall door. No note, no announcement, just metal, waiting. Akiko saw it first. She didn't pick it up, but she stood near it for a long time. Finally, another woman, the one who used to teach music to children in Nagoya, lifted it. She didn't play, just turned it in her hands like a relic. That night, a few women gathered by the barracks window. No one spoke. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, and from somewhere beyond the wire a cowboy's voice rose again. Softer this time, almost tender. Some women pressed fingers to their lips, unsure whether to cry or smile. Others just listened. Music had no allegiance. It wasn't American. It wasn't Japanese. It was simply a bridge, a tremble in the air between two broken worlds, asking nothing in return but to be heard. The bridge collapsed the following night. Kindness, it turned out, could only stretch so far before it snapped something inside. For Yumi, the quiet woman from Nagasaki, who rarely laughed and never sang, the weight became unbearable. She had survived malaria, bombing raids, and starvation with a numb efficiency. But survival here, in clean beds with full stomachs and songs drifting through the dark, felt like a betrayal she could not reconcile. She waited until the barracks fell silent. The others slept, breathing evenly, worn down by days that asked them to feel again. Yumi slipped from her bunk and moved toward the wash basin. Her hands did not shake. That frightened her most. She had hidden a length of cloth beneath her mattress days earlier, torn from her uniform. She wrapped it carefully, methodically, the way she'd been taught to bind wounds. Only this time she meant to close one forever. "Better to die than live without honor," the voice inside her whispered. "Better to disappear than be softened by the enemy." She stood on the bench, looped the cloth, and closed her eyes. "Yumi." The voice was barely louder than breath. Akiko stood in the doorway, her hair loose, eyes wide. She had woken to the creak of wood and known, without knowing how, what was happening. She crossed the room in 2 steps and grabbed Yumi's wrist. Yumi resisted at first, weakly. "Let me go," she said. "I can't live like this." "Like what?" Akiko asked, her voice breaking. "Alive?" Yumi sobbed then, not the neat, restrained crying of discipline, but the raw, gasping kind she hadn't allowed herself since girlhood. She collapsed into Akiko's arms, shaking. "They see us as human," Yumi whispered, "and I don't know who I am if that's true." Akiko held her tightly. Around them the others stirred, sitting up, drawn by the sound. No one shouted, no one judged. They watched as something fragile unfolded in front of them. "If they still see us as human," Akiko said softly, "why can't we?" The words fell into the room like a stone dropped into water. Ripples spread outward, quiet, irreversible. Yumi was lowered gently to the floor. Someone fetched water. Another brought a blanket. No guards came running. No punishment followed. The crisis passed not with force, but with hands held and breaths counted together in the dark. After that night, something shifted. The shame didn't vanish, but it changed direction. It no longer pointed outward at the enemy. It turned inward, toward the lie they had been forced to live inside. That lie said their worth was conditional, that life without sacrifice was meaningless, that kindness was weakness. But the desert didn't care about those lies. The seeds kept growing. The harmonica kept singing. The guards kept showing up day after day, neither saviors nor demons, just men doing a job with decency. Yumi didn't speak much after that, but she ate, she slept, she tended the garden with Akiko, her hands careful, deliberate. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she smiled at the tiny leaves pushing through the soil. The war still raged somewhere beyond the wire. Men were still dying. Cities still burned. But inside the camp, something else was ending. The old story, the one that said survival was shameful, the one that demanded death as proof of loyalty. In its place, a quieter voice began to form, uncertain, fragile, but persistent. Maybe I am worth saving. If this story is moving you, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Tap the like button so more people can hear these hidden stories. The words stayed with her when the announcement came. There was no ceremony, no dramatic speech, just a guard standing near the gate one morning, hat in his hands, saying slowly, carefully, that the war was over. Japan had surrendered. The women stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language, which of course he was. But the meaning cut through anyway. Surrender. The word they had been taught was worse than death had finally happened, and yet the world did not end. They were told to pack their belongings. There were not many. A folded blanket, a bar of soap worn thin by use. Letters they had written and never received replies to. Some tucked away seeds from the garden, dry now, wrapped in paper like talismans. The guards avoided eye contact as they loaded them onto trucks, not out of cruelty, but something closer to awkward respect. No one cheered. No one cried. The camp that had once felt like a contradiction now felt like something fragile being dismantled. As the trucks rolled away, Akiko looked back through the slats. The garden was still there, small and stubborn, green against the dust. No one waved. No one said goodbye. The wire receded into the distance, and with it the strange, impossible chapter of their lives where enemies had fed them, sung to them, and asked nothing in return. The journey home was quiet. Ships crossed gray water under heavy skies. The women huddled together not for warmth, but familiarity. No one spoke of the future. They were afraid to imagine it. When they arrived, Japan did not greet them. It lay in ruins. Cities were flattened into fields of ash. Streets they remembered were gone, replaced by silence and scavengers picking through debris. The air smelled of smoke and rot. Children with hollow eyes lined up for watery soup. Women bartered family heirlooms for handfuls of rice. Akiko found what remained of her neighborhood after 3 days of searching. Her house was a blackened foundation. Her mother was gone. A neighbor told her she had died during an air raid, buried beneath rubble with no marker. Akiko bowed until her back ached. There were no tears left. The others fared no better. Families were scattered or dead, brothers missing. Fathers returned as strangers, broken, silent, ashamed. And the women themselves were met not with relief, but suspicion. Where were you during the war? Why are you alive when so many are not? They did not speak of the camp, not at first. How could they explain that captivity had fed them when freedom had starved them? That American cowboys had sung to them while their own cities burned? That they had slept in clean beds while children in Tokyo gnawed on bark? To speak of it felt obscene, and yet the memories followed them. The smell of beef drifting across a ruined street could bring Akiko to her knees. Soap, real soap, became unbearable, its lavender scent pulling her back to the barracks, to the garden, to nights when music floated through the dark. The war had ended, but inside them it continued. Some women tried to bury those months entirely, refusing to think of them as anything but a nightmare. Others clung to the memories as proof that another way of living had once existed. A few whispered to one another when they met by chance in markets or shelters. They spoke softly of the harmonica, of the seeds, of the night Yumi was saved. Yumi survived. She worked in a factory outside Hiroshima, her hands scarred, her eyes distant. She never spoke of the attempt, but sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, she hummed an American tune under her breath, off-key, barely audible. No parades marked their return, no medals, no apologies. They were expected to rebuild, to endure, to forget. But forgetting proved impossible. Because somewhere in the middle of the war, behind barbed wire in a desert they had never heard of, the enemy had shown them dignity. And once seen, dignity could not be unseen. The world demanded silence. Their memories refused. She didn't expect it. Just another errand on an ordinary afternoon in Osaka, decades after the war, with the sky low and gray and the market humming with the chatter of people trying to live. Akiko had grown old quietly. No titles, no medals, no stories. She bought radishes, wiped sweat from her neck with a faded handkerchief, and turned a corner. That's when it hit her. The smell. Meat roasting over open flame. A flash of pepper, smoke, and fat rising into the air. Not like home cooking, but something older, wilder. She staggered. Her knees didn't buckle, but her hand reached out for the nearest wall, steadying her like a wave had struck. For a moment, she wasn't in Osaka anymore. She was in Nevada, dust everywhere, wire fences. A man in a cowboy hat, humming through his teeth while flipping beef over an open flame, not laughing, not gloating, just cooking. She closed her eyes and breathed it in. The scent that once signaled death had not come, only hunger, only memory. She never spoke of it to the young vendor who looked at her with concern. "Daijoubu desu," she whispered. "I'm fine." She walked on. But she wasn't, not entirely. The war had carved her, not visibly. Her hands still worked, her voice still sang. But inside, she carried layers no one saw. And every now and then, something like this, a scent, a sound, a note from a harmonica blown off key, cracked those layers wide open. It wasn't just her. Yumi lived in Nagano now, tucked away in a house that faced the mountains. She taught children how to read. No one there knew what she had nearly done in the desert. No one knew how close she'd come to vanishing. But sometimes, in class, when the wind shifted and brought with it the scent of wild grass or the trace of wood smoke, she would stop mid-sentence and stare at the window for a long time. She still hummed, never loudly, never enough to be noticed, but the melody lived in her chest like a heartbeat, slow, persistent, real. None of the women were welcomed as heroes. None had been expected to return. And when they did, they carried stories too strange to be believed and too painful to explain. So they carried them in silence, and yet those months in the camp, those impossible days of beef stew, soap, songs, and soil, shaped every year that followed, not because they erased the war, but because they revealed a sliver of mercy inside it. The enemy had fed them, the enemy had sung to them, and in doing so, the enemy had done something no rifle ever could, given them back the smallest shape of their humanity. Akiko once told a nurse, quietly, while recovering from pneumonia, "He didn't smile because he won. He smiled because he chose not to hate me." That was it. That was everything. It didn't absolve the bombs. It didn't undo the death. But it mattered. Because in a war built on the machinery of dehumanization, someone, a cowboy with dust on his boots, had chosen to offer dignity instead. And that dignity had rippled forward in time, through gardens, through songs, through scars that never fully healed but no longer bled. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, it brought smoke, and in that smoke there was memory, not just of survival, but of kindness. If this story moved you, hit like and leave a comment below with where you're watching from. These are the stories that history nearly forgot, and they deserve to be remembered.